Welcome, friends. We are delighted to have you with us today as we host our first SGI quarterly webinar for 2021. With COVID-19 impacting nearly every aspect of our lives, 2020 was an unprecedentedly difficult year. It also, along with the Black Lives Matter movement, brings new focus and new energy to quite a number of engagements this year. And so we're going to be delving into that as we talk with our guests. As usual, we'll begin with participants in listen-only mode until the question and answer section, and we'll make our recording and slides available on our website after this. Let's begin with a brief reflection that I'm calling a prayer for discomfort. Lord, help us wallow in our discomfort, stew in our unease, sit with our disquiet, as we journey through this racialized pandemic, seeing clear inequities, anger, hurt. Aid us in our focus. How are we people for and with others? Help us open our eyes as we look at our own community. What do they look like? What voices are absent? Help us acknowledge our history, what we have done to exclude, persecute, and silence. How have we been complicit? Forgive us for not being there, for not doing enough. How can we invite, empower, and lift up these voices? We need to do better. We need to move now. How can we invite to our tables? Who can we invite to our tables? Help us to go to the margins, especially those at our own institutions. Let us stand with the lonely, the sick, the persecuted, those who have been violated. Let us sit with them in our own unease. Help us listen to these voices. Help us reflect. Help us prayerfully act. Help us rise, not to erase our discomfort, but to be fully present, seeking solidarity, seeking repentance. Lord, help us wallow in our discomfort. Let us lean in. Amen. So we have with us, and we're delighted to have with us, two fabulous companions today, Klemmer and Hanna Lucal. We'll hear more about them before each of their portions of the presentation. I just want to give a little context, though, to what we're looking at. And I'm calling this in a certain way foreseeable failures. We'll also then move to, well, sorry, Frank, we'll go back. We'll talk also about our essential workers in COVID. We'll talk about racial equity, and we'll have time for some question and answers. So now we can go forward, Frank, sorry. Foreseeable failures. We know that at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, many Americans were shocked at the sight of empty shelves in stores as global supply chains sputtered to keep up with the demand for a variety of products. The fragility of these supply chains has suddenly become evident to a lot of Americans who expect them to always operate seamlessly. Those supply chains are built to be ruthlessly efficient, manufacturing and delivering goods exactly when and where they're needed. The ability to move quickly and seamlessly across the globe also helps companies find cheap labor or other opportunities to make products more cheaply. While this system may be good for corporate owners and supply chain managers, it takes a toll on workers. In the face of COVID-19, poultry workers literally put their life on the line every time they punch into work. And the opportunity of 2021 is to place worker dignity at the center of supply chain transformation plans. The Black Lives Matter movement has also created an unprecedented urgency for more genuinely diverse and inclusive workforces. The COVID-19 pandemic has inflicted devastating effects on the US economy, with job losses, especially concentrated among women, minorities, and low-wage workers. It illustrates that the systemic racism that lives in our financial institutions. Corporations have made statements in support of Black Lives Matter, but statements are easy. Ensuring that people of color are hired, paid, promoted, and retained equitably is less so. We cannot allow the corporate response to be merely words. Together, we can compel action. And so we're going to take an investigation into these kinds of themes today. And Frank, why don't we move one more slide? Just to keep in the back of your mind as well, some of the filings that you, our members, have put in for 2021 are with companies like Google and Amazon, Home Depot, et cetera, that have this as a lens in particular that we're addressing. And so we move one more slide, Frank. We will begin to look especially at essential workers in COVID, and leading us in this portion of the conversation particularly is Corey Klemmer, who joined Domini Impact Investments in 2018 as Director of Engagement. Her diverse experience with law, financial analysis, corporate engagements, and issue-based organizing enables her to lead Domini's efforts as a voice for change. Prior to joining Domini, Ms. Klemmer, Corey, served as an analyst at the AFL-CIO Office of Investment, where she worked with pension funds, policymakers, and other stakeholders to advocate for forward-thinking investor perspectives on many issues, including systemic risks, human capital management, student debt, criminal justice reform, and corporate disclosure reform. Her legal writing is focused on operationalizing corporate social responsibility and responsible investing with special attention to fiduciary duties. She's an attorney barred into New York and a CFA charter holder, graduate of Amherst College, and with her JD from Tulane University Law School. Corey, please.
That's too long of an introduction. I feel very lucky to be here with you all today and able to join you for this conversation. I was just going to start by giving a little bit of an overview of Domini. We've been doing responsible investing since the 90s, and I think it's helpful to understand, I've come at this work from, an organizing perspective, both on climate and social justice, from organizing, from legal, political. I've really tried a lot of different levers for change, and ultimately came to finance as the place where I saw the greatest opportunity to create systemic change. And, it's still an uphill battle, but I do think it's helpful just to understand a little context about how we do that. So with Domini, we invest mostly in large public companies in the US and abroad, and we do have a fixed income product as well. And all of that is built on our two core values: universal human dignity and ecological sustainability. And so we have a ton of kind of process and framework, but it's really comes back to those roots. And, on the one hand, I can imagine saying these words every year since I could learn to speak, but it really feels like the last year highlighted our shortcomings on both fronts and the urgency of action. I think that's fair to say. So, we mentioned, Chris mentioned at the top about COVID and then also racial inequity. And I think we also just saw how closely connected those were, as well as economic injustice. And, corporations play a large role in that. And I think they can play a role to make it better, but it's my job at Domini is to work with them to drive that change. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just speak a little bit about how we do this. So in the first order of business for Domini is we have like a very developed, and you can look at it on our website. We have a lot of information there, but about our standards, where every company and every issuer we look at with, key performance indicators that are specific to that sub-industry. So, we don't invest in private prisons or for-profit prisons, but and we exclude most energy, but we have renewable energy. So we have like very specific indicators down at the company level that let us determine, there's some stuff that's excluded outright, like nuclear, no way, weapons, no way. And then there's some stuff that we will look at and make a judgment about. You're doing this well, you're doing it poorly, and we'll only invest in the better companies. So that sets us up with a portfolio of companies that are relatively better than their peers. We also do community investing, where we specifically try to address certain problems with our investments. Like we'll specifically go to this company is solving a water issue, or this company is really filling a gap in this community. Let's say we're going to buy the debt of a nonprofit hospital because we believe that's going to support an anchor institution in a community, and they're doing really forward-thinking health work on community health. And then the last tool is engagement. And so that's what I do. I get to work with the companies in the portfolio to try to drive this change. And you can go to the next slide. So thank you. The way I do this is, and you guys have been a part of this with us, which has been great in many instances, but these are just some examples of how it's public statements, expressing investor perspectives to the market on why this makes sense, not just from a moral and ethical position, but also from a business and financial position, that helps move people. And that's the goal, right? And speaking directly with companies, in many cases, we have ongoing dialogues with companies. We use shareholder proposals like Chris just mentioned. And again, we were joined in one of them by one of your members this year, which was great. And then using proxy voting, which is, it's one of those kind of very boring plumbing issues in this system, but actually can have a pretty significant impact when it's done well. So those are just some of the tools. And my role is in many ways to kind of translate these moral issues that represent our core values into something that businesses can onboard and do something about. So I have some examples that I'm going to walk through about what we've done in response to 2020. Go to here we go. So right in March, when this all started really kicked off last year, and just I think caught everyone pretty unprepared. We worked with ICCR and the New York Comptroller's Office, the City Comptroller, and put out a statement with 5 core recommendations for companies that included providing paid sick leave, doing more health and safety work for their workers and their communities, among several other things. But it really had a lot to do about protecting workers and communities. And many of you joined that statement, so thank you. We ended up really very quickly with a huge number of signatories, which is an amazing thing. This usually takes a very long time, but we, within 2 weeks, had almost $5 trillion in assets under management signed on to the letter. And then without any further organizing, just organically grew to $9.5 trillion today with 336 different signatories from all over the world. So we were really pleased. We had representation, I think, from every continent. So just an amazing response, I think, indicative of, it's funny when you see people in finance really stretch their own language because they feel the moral urgency. But I think that's what happened in a lot of cases. And then that was able to support a ton of spin-off efforts. So like people writing to apparel companies about issues in the supply chain could refer back and say, look, here's 336 signatories, and they all are saying, you need to do more to protect your workers, keep them on the payroll, give them paid leave, and provide them PPE or whatever they need to do their job safely. So I think, and it also got a ton of media attention. So I think that was like a great example of working together and how everyone's participation really was able to drive something that was meaningful in a lot of different venues going forward. We also filed a shareholder proposal at Kohl's about paid leave, and I think you guys are all quite familiar with Kohl's. And this is it's an example of how you have to kind of recraft your message so that it can reach the audience. Like we have to get through a process at the SEC, and then it has to get into it, go to a vote in front of other shareholders. And how do you do it in a way that kind of jumps through all those hoops, but can still make a difference at the end of the day? And so Kohl's tried to fight us. They don't want it to go on their proxy. But we have new leadership at the SEC. So we're kind of like fingers crossed, waiting to get an answer. And I think more than ever before, we have a chance at getting this through. And it'll ask shareholders, like, should Kohl's more seriously consider giving paid leave to all their employees? And we framed it as asking for a report about whether they could do it, for some of the reasons I just mentioned. But again, I think it's the kind of thing, and this is also why proxy voting is important. It can show a directional interest of the shareholder base, that they care about paid leave, they care about the workers, they want to see management being serious and taking action on it. So that's kind of pending, but we're excited to see where that goes. I would go to the next slide. We filed another proposal, and this was in collaboration with a group called the Human Capital Management Coalition. And it was about workforce equity. We filed it at Disney and Chipotle. And this was a very different kind of experience because both companies, as soon as we filed it, they were like, let's talk. we want to do this. This makes sense. And we're not going to fight you on this. And so they both made changes to their governing documents, which means that now for both companies, their compensation committees have new responsibilities to consider the whole workforce. Traditionally, comp committees just look at how much should we pay the executives for the next 3 years. It's a wild cottage industry that absorbs so much resources, both in terms of the compensation, but also like hiring consultants to do very expensive reports to say, yeah, you should give them a raise. And somehow that's always the answer that they come to. And this year it's like, look, how are you going to spend all of your energy deciding what to pay your executives? You don't even know what you pay your frontline workers, or you're paying them below minimum wage. How can you do all of this work on exec comp and you're not even thinking about this? And so the board is technically our representative as an investor. They represent us and they hire and fire management. So that's kind of where our leverage is. So we said, look, board needs to be in charge of this. They need to be competent. They need to be responsible, accountable for this. And so this made a change where they're formally accountable for it now. So that means that if they do a bad job, we vote against them. And a lot of people might vote against them because they have this responsibility to their investors. It's now formal, it's legal. And if they fail at it, there's an accountability mechanism. But hopefully they're going to be good at it. I could say a little more color on how these companies are different, I think, in their commitment to the issue. But in both cases, they're going to help us to meet with the comp committee directors, one of them at least. In Chipotle's case, I think we'll meet with someone from the comp committee and the audit and risk committee, and maybe their independent lead director. So they're going to be available to us. We're going to raise our issues. And in the proposal and the letter we sent before the proposal, we made really clear that, look, how you deal with frontline workers is how you deal with racial justice, because your frontline workers are disproportionately, and gender justice, because they're disproportionately women and disproportionately non-white. And the intersection of COVID and racial justice on so many fronts right now is the impacts are significantly bad. And, we talk about it as a liability for the company, both in terms of legal liability and reputational risk, but obviously, there's a broader set of ethical concerns behind it as well. So those are both ongoing. And that's a case where you file the proposal and you withdraw it. And it's good because you're getting a commitment and you're getting, progress to move forward with the company. Amazon is another place where we've been very concerned about the workers. And in this case, we've had a dialogue with Amazon about worker issues for years. Since I was at the AFL, I was doing the same work. And most recently, I don't know if you've been following, but they have a vote coming on forming a union at one of their warehouses in Alabama. And that's a huge deal. It would be the first unionized Amazon warehouse in the country. And, they have a commitment to labor rights and their policies, but they've set up a website called Do It Without Dues, and they're holding captive audience meetings to just share information, but very forcefully about the problems with unions. So we joined a letter to the company to say, you need to honor your commitments to the ILO here and stop what you're doing. And they, obviously they did not stop, but we will continue with that engagement. One more slide. I think this is, the last one, just to kind of round out some of these examples. We also filed at Tesla about diversity and inclusion issues, and we withdrew there as well, because they agreed to file their first report on the issue. And they did that at the end of last year, and it allowed us to see, the internal numbers. It could have been better, and we're working with them on improving it and also improving the performance on the actual metrics. But without the data, it's really hard to have a meaningful conversation about what they're doing. And this report did reveal what kind of representation they had among their Black workers, their Asian workers, their Indigenous workers. And so a bunch of categories. It also showed how many new hires were in each category, how many, what the promotion rate was for each category. And then there was a lot of anecdotal stuff about, spotlighting individuals, which is fine for them. But, the numbers were interesting and gives us a baseline to say, okay, where are we going to go from here? And are you improving or not over time? And then this last example I just threw in here because it's a, proxy voting. I'm telling you, it's boring and important. So we have a really strong policy on board diversity. We will vote against in places where there's no nominating committee, which is Japan. Generally, they don't have those committees. We vote against the whole board if you don't have 40% women on the board. And I will tell you, I think Sony is the only Japanese company that we have held that has 40% women. So it's a very steep standard, but we engage consistently with our portfolio companies to say, look, we voted against all your directors again, and here's why. And, it's funny, they're all human too, and that's kind of personal to them. So when you say, look, I voted against you, and I'm going to tell you why, you usually strike a chord, which is, that's just human, I guess. But we have seen the needle starting to move in Japan, which is, it's significant because it's been such an issue there for so long. So over the last year, among the companies that we engaged, we saw the average representation go from about 9 to 12 and a half. And so we're going to keep tracking that and keep pushing on it. But it's just an example of how your proxy voting guidelines, and so for many of you, I imagine it would be the guidelines of the managers that you hire. How do they vote on issues like board diversity? And we also vote on racial diversity in some markets, but the data is very uneven in different markets. But the same standard, 40% diversity, or we vote against the board or the nominating committee. But it's one of those mechanics, very boring, easy to ignore. But, if you're so inclined, talk to your asset manager about it, or, whoever's in charge of your proxy voting. And it's a way to really send a clear signal to the market and express your values that way. So, and I will stop talking after this, but just quickly to mention, and this was one of the things that we were able to refer back to the COVID statement with, but we've been also engaging apparel companies about forced labor in the Uyghur province in China. And that's a very tricky issue, but obviously it's very, very serious. And we've seen a variety of responses, but we're really trying to push people towards the standards in the call to action to end forced Uyghur labor. And there's 2 brands that have joined that call to action, but others people are very sensitive about what they do in China. It's, the wrong step. They feel like maybe they're going to expose their workers to something negative or get kicked out of one of the biggest consumer and supplier markets in the world. And so very tricky issue, but obviously incredibly important human rights issues at stake. And so that's another place where we've been engaging. But now I'm done, and I look forward to answering questions at the end. I hope I didn't take up too much time.
That was tremendous, Corey. Thank you. So glad to have you with us. And take notes on questions you've got along the way, or put them in the chat box as well. Moving on to focus a bit more on racial equity then. We've got with us leading this part of the conversation, Hanna Lucal. Her pronouns are she and her. She's the Associate Director of Open Mic, a nonprofit organization that organizes investor support for corporate accountability campaigns in the media and tech industry. Hanna's work targets major companies that sell surveillance technology, enable the spread of racism and disinformation online, or do business with government agencies using technology in ways that violate civil and human rights. As a 2020-2021 Take Back Tech Fellow with Just Futures Law and Mi Gente, Hanna is researching the role of technology in police and ICE surveillance in major US cities and its effect on Black, Latinx, and immigrant communities. In 2017, she helped launch Racial Justice Investing, a network that many of us within ICCR participate, that builds investor solidarity with social justice movement groups and provides education about alternatives to racial capitalism. Hanna also facilitates anti-racism workshops for teachers as a trainer with the Center for Racial Justice in Education. Hanna, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you so much for having me this morning. It's good to be with you all. Thanks, Corey, too, for your presentation. So let's see, Frank, yes, thank you. That is my first slide. It's gray and wintry out, so I thought I'd add some summery colors to my slides this morning. But as Chris mentioned, my name is Hanna. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm Today going to be talking both wearing my hat as Associate Director of Open Mic and also in my role as one of the coordinators of the Racial Justice Investing Network. And I'll share more about both of those groups, and I know some of you are a part of RJI. And I'm going to go through a lot, so if you want to connect more, please reach out to me after this call, and I would love to chat more. So what are we up to today? So I'm going to talk about, from my understanding, what it means for investors to support the movement for racial justice, as well as give an open mic focus on tech and media, what the role of tech and media companies is specifically in perpetuating racism, and what we're doing about it at Open Mic, and how we are working with shareholders who are doing shareholder resolutions, company engagements, open letters, and working alongside grassroots movement organizations to echo their demands of tech and media companies around the ways that they are violating civil and human rights. So I'm going to start just by framing a little bit about what I mean when I say racial justice, and how at Open Mic we use a racial justice lens in our work, and then I'll provide some examples of what that looks like. So for folks who are not familiar or not yet participating, racial justice investing is a network that, as Chris mentioned, it's been around since I think 2016 or 2017. And we have a few goals. Some of our goals are just to create a space in the impact investing industry to talk about what it means to apply a racial justice lens to our work, both internally inside organizations and institutions, and also externally in having engagements with companies, developing asks of companies, et cetera. And for the past year, we've been working more to specify what are our values as a community, because while we have a network of about 350 people and everyone who shows up absolutely is on board with racial justice and working towards that as a reality, we also realize that we all come into this work and into this conversation with a different definition of racism. We don't necessarily have a shared analysis of systemic racism, and we don't necessarily have a shared understanding of how racial capitalism operates and the history of it and what that means for investors specifically. So I'm going to start just by sharing the racial justice investing's value around racial justice, which says that racial justice and equity are guiding principles for a world in which all systems of oppression are abolished. For our work, we acknowledge that capitalism in the United States is rooted in racism, extracting resources from communities of color in order to maintain power for a white elite. Centering racial justice as a value demands centering the voices, experiences, cultures, and intellect of people of color in envisioning economic systems that honor the liberation and humanity of all people. And I will share later in the chat, we have a link to all of our working values as a network if you want to check those out. So basically, we recognize that the US economy was built on exploitation, on racism, on enslaving people, on stealing land from Native people, and that the impact of this is still present with us today. And so there are a few examples of how investors, including probably many folks on this call, are applying a racial justice lens to their work. And that includes things like when making asks of companies, when developing shareholder resolutions, when making investment decisions, always following the leadership of Black, Indigenous, and people of color organizers. It also includes things like making direct investments or moving money into BIPOC-led efforts to create an alternative economy that works for everyone. And it also includes, and this is a lot of the work that we do at RJI, actually talking through and learning about how investment institutions are part of participating in and perpetuating the harms of racial capitalism. Next slide, please. So this is a comic that you may have seen that my colleague at RJI, Ivy Jack, who works at North Star Asset Management, shared with me. And I love it because it as a white person who's committed to racial justice work, it humbles me and it reminds me that naming racism and acknowledging the existence of racism is really only the very basic first step towards racial justice, and that both personally and as a society, we have a long way to go. And it also just reminds me that racial justice isn't, or anti-racism for us individually is not a destination. It's really something that we can express moment by moment in our actions. And so RJI exists to support investors in grappling with where we are as an industry and that we have a long way to go, and to support momentum towards actually embedding racial justice in our day-to-day actions. And another big part of what we do is connecting investors to folks of color who are leading the movement for racial justice and who are on the front lines of developing demands and strategies around corporate accountability. So at Open Mic, we, as I mentioned, we're focused on tech and media companies specifically. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why we are focused on those industries and what that means in terms of using a racial justice lens. So one of the groups that we partner with is Mi Gente. And Mi Gente talks a lot about the role of tech companies in enabling racism. So, for example, throughout history, small groups of people have taken resources from the vast majority of people in order to have power. And now tech companies are repeating this cycle, but data is the new thing that is being taken up to build wealth and power for a select few. So at Open Mic, we are consistently building relationships and working alongside civil rights groups, media justice groups, immigrant justice groups, and other racial justice groups to make sure that the shareholder advocacy work that we support is in alignment with and echoing the demands of those groups. And so within racial capitalism, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we recognize that big business in the United States started with the big business of slavery. And that business and that wealth building was built on the extraction of wealth and resources. And that same system is playing out today with tech companies who are now building wealth by extracting data from all of us. And in many cases, that process is also replicating racism and surveillance. So here is a graphic from Mi Gente that just shows some examples of the kinds of tech companies that we're dealing with, from Thomson Reuters, Facebook, Amazon, Palantir, and these are all now publicly held companies. And you may be aware that every time you use your phone or go on Facebook or watch a YouTube video or log into Spotify or sign up for a credit card online, your data and the information about what you're doing online and what you're looking at and what you're clicking on is being collected. And that information is being traded, it's being sold, and it's being handed over to third parties all the time in order to make profit. And a lot of the time, we're now seeing that the impact of that is exacerbating racism. So it's often really hard to understand what data is being collected about us, what tech companies are doing with it, who they're sharing it with, and what the impact is. For example, Thomson Reuters has a $60 million contract with ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and ICE uses their software to carry out their deportation and detention efforts. So here's another slide from Mi Gente just showing some of the tech tools that are used by police and within the criminal injustice system. So this includes things like facial recognition software, biometric data tech gathering tools. It also includes algorithmic decision-making tools or artificial intelligence. And these tech tools are used by police, but they're also used by all sorts of institutions. And so increasingly, we're learning about how artificial intelligence tools are being used to make decisions about whether someone gets hired for a job or whether someone can get a loan from a bank, or even whether someone goes to jail. And these are often unregulated, and there's no accountability both to the folks marketing and developing these tools or to the folks who purchase them. and use them in ways that really impact people's lives, sometimes in ways around life or death decisions. So tech and police have a mutual relationship around data collection and extraction. And tech companies are profiting from gathering this data and sharing it or selling it. And police are using this data collection process to surveil whole communities, disproportionately impacting communities of color, including immigrant communities. But as we know, surveillance is not safe. Surveillance does not keep us or our communities safe. And so I want to share this quote from the Movement for Black Lives policy platform around defunding police. And it says, "We know the safest communities in America are places that don't center the police. What we're looking for already exists, and we already know it works. We need look no further than neighborhoods where the wealthy, well-connected, and well-off live, or anywhere there's easy access to living wages, healthcare, quality public education, and freedom from police terror." So I share this quote because one thing that I think about a lot is when we hear the Movement for Black Lives and the Black Lives Matter movement say defund police, we also can think about what is the role of tech companies in resourcing police to carry out racist policing practices, and what does it mean for investors to be going to tech companies in our engagements and saying, what does it mean for you to divest those resources, including surveillance technology, from police, and make sure that that companies are not equipping police with harmful tools. So when I say tech companies are perpetuating systemic racism, I want to share just a few examples of what I mean. So on the left here on the chart, you can see just some examples of systemic racism that have existed since the founding of this country, which include racial profiling, housing discrimination, voter suppression. And then on the right-hand side, you can see some examples of how tech companies, big brand names that we all know, are implicated in this. So for example, police use facial recognition technology. In Michigan, there was an example of police using facial recognition technology without the consent or knowledge of communities, and then arresting a Black person who had done no crime. Another example is the fact that Facebook allows elected officials on the platform to spread lies, including disinformation about voting, to discourage Black people and other communities of color from going to the polls. And Facebook has even allowed advertisers to discriminate based on race, based on gender and age, when serving up advertisements on their platform about housing and employment and credit. So these are just some examples. There are many, many more. And there's also many examples that haven't been documented, but we do know that the impact is happening, even if there isn't research yet about it. And the reason we know that is because people online and offline have been saying this for years. So this is a quote from Claudia Rankine, who's a poet and a writer and an artist, and who says, "Whiteness is not something I would limit to white people. We all have to begin to understand as writers, artists, academics, nurses, doctors, engineers, IT people, and anybody making an algorithm, that if we are not careful, we are reinstating the tenets of whiteness." So how did we get here, right? Tech companies, as you know, have been disproportionately staffed and run by white people since they began a few decades ago. That's one reason why these companies continue to reinforce racism. But another reason, in addition to the lack of racial diversity, is that the business model of big tech is surveillance. It is data extraction. And there has long been a priority of profit over people in this industry, which always reproduces racism. So at Open Mic, here are some examples of shareholder resolutions that we've supported this year that look at how companies and their algorithms are reinstating the tenets of whiteness, as Claudia Rankine says, including through things like surveillance, censorship, discrimination, and just a disregard for civil and human rights. So each of these represents a set of shareholder resolutions. Some of you may be co-filers or lead filers on these. And for example, at Alphabet, Facebook, and Twitter, we've supported shareholders in asking the companies to appoint to their board of directors someone with civil and human rights expertise. We're also looking at the role of advertisers. So there's a lot of hate speech and misinformation that's going all over the internet, and social medias are facilitating that and profiting from that. But advertisers also have a role in financing that content that is online. And so we're also looking at that. And we have supported shareholder resolutions at Omnicom and Home Depot this year. And then we're also looking specifically at the market of surveillance tech, including at Amazon, products like Recognition and their Ring surveillance home doorbells. Some other examples of the shareholder advocacy work we've supported this year include seeking transparency from companies like Alphabet about what are governments asking these companies to hand over in terms of the data that they're providing to governments, including authoritarian fascist regimes. They will hand over user data, and we need more information about how they make those decisions and what information they're providing to governments. We're also worried about Alphabet, particularly has a track record of retaliating against workers who speak up about ethical issues at the company, including issues that present a lot of reputational and business risk. And we want to make sure that they have stronger whistleblower policies in place. And then at Facebook, we've supported some shareholder resolutions around content governance and just looking at Facebook's ability to tweak its algorithmic decisions to crank up the amount of misinformation that spreads or turn it down. And we know that they have those abilities, and we want them to be using them responsibly, not just for profit. Lastly, I'll just share that, just to reiterate here that when we do racial justice work at Open Mic, really what we're thinking about is how to follow the leadership of people who are closest to the problem, who are also the people who are closest to the solution. So with racial justice work, that looks like following the leadership of people of color. And Sudette Harry talks about this in an article in Wired that's called Listening to Black Women, the Innovation Tech Can't Figure Out, and says MSNBC recently revealed that Russian operatives had been posing as Black people to spread misinformation. Black women have been chronicling this fakery for years. Even though Black women were the first to expose the alt-right 6 years ago, their work and the alarms they've rung consistently remain uncredited and unheard. Platforms often take weeks to intercept targeted harassment of Black women, to the point where other users simply describing the abuse and delay of intervention are targeted. So we've seen this as a huge pattern. Oftentimes, Black women and other users on these platforms will call out to the companies telling them what is happening online and their responsibility to address it. And the companies will consistently ignore them, punish them, or deny that the problem exists. But over the years, we've seen that at a certain point, they can't deny it any longer when the problem becomes so great and it becomes a public catastrophe, or it turns into a white supremacist insurrection at the Capitol. And so in those cases, when it gets to that point, so much harm has already been done, and they may then fix their policies. But even when their policies improve, we find that enforcement of those policies is a huge issue. So lastly, just to share, what are some things that we support investors in asking of companies? We support investors in asking companies to respond to the needs of BIPOC communities who are most impacted by racist technology, to end ties with government agencies who are using technology in harmful ways, to assess the impact of sales of unregulated surveillance tech products, to establish stronger governance and oversight around civil and human rights issues, including at the board and leadership level, and to support regulation. But I'll share a caveat with that because you have a lot of companies like Microsoft who lobby really hard against state privacy laws that allow for bans on things like facial recognition technology. And it can get really dangerous, and it is really dangerous with Microsoft particularly, who has done a lot to prevent meaningful regulation around privacy, data protection, and anti-surveillance regulation. So we suggest that companies do support regulation, but only if that is regulation that's supported by communities who are most likely to be harmed by the technology. And lastly, I'll just share this quote from the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, Tendai Achumi, who says that artificial intelligence systems are at their core systems of discrimination. There can no longer be any doubt that emerging digital technologies have a striking capacity to reproduce, reinforce, and even exacerbate racial inequality within and across societies. Tech is a product of society, its values, its priorities, and even its inequities, including those related to racism and intolerance. So thank you. This is my info. Please feel free to connect with Open Mic on Twitter or our website. You can email me. And if you'd like to join the RJI network, you can email Racial Justice Investing plus subscribe at Google Groups, or just email me. And I'll put a link in the chat. We have a Open Mic resource list on surveillance tech issues.
Thank you, Hannah. I guess I'd want to start maybe this period of question and answers just by drawing on one of the phrases you used. That's a commonality, I think, for both presentations. You said people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. I think over and over again, we see that working out, that the persons who experience structural racism are the ones who have the best eyes to be able to see it. Corey and I were fortunate last January, before all this, to travel to Immokalee, Florida, to spend some time with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in the Fair Food Program. And one of the things that became absolutely clear in that as well is that the people who best understand what happens to farm workers, or more specifically even tomato workers, are they themselves. And they have the kind of best insights for how to resolve or move forward with some of the challenges that they experience in the workplace. And the opportunities we have then that SGI has in our own planning and efforts tried to prioritize staying close to impacted communities and to hearing their voice and to being able to advocate for them. So with that, maybe I'll open it and just say, anybody have some questions?
Sorry, Chris, I've opened now the mic for everyone to just unmute yourself. I think we're a size that can cope with hopefully not talk over each other. Maybe I'm gonna since I got the mic, quickly, Hannah, you went through a lot of shareholder resolutions on various topics, primarily focused on tech companies. What has been the company response to these proposals? Do they, I guess it's case by case, but do they engage you openly? Do they recognize the problems and trying to solve them? Is it one of ignorance, or is it a deep-rooted, understood part of their business model? I'll go on mute.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I would say to some extent it varies a little bit company to company, and overall, I would say that, because the business model for a lot of these companies is based on data extraction and building, machine learning tools. Some people say the product is free, the product is you, right? They are aware that this is their profit model, and a lot of what I've read from folks who have been whistleblowers at these companies or have left these companies and then spoken up, or even from folks who currently work at these companies, is that there is a climate where until something becomes a reputational risk, until it's on the front page of the New York Times, or there's actually employee outcry, that they really ignore it. And so we are trying to support kind of lifting up the extent of reputational risk in the shareholder resolutions. And a lot of these companies have faced questioning at congressional hearings. They're facing antitrust regulation. They're facing their own employees are quitting and writing scathing reports about what it was like to work there and how a lot of these ethical issues just get completely squashed by leadership. So that seems to be a pattern across the industry overall. And a lot of the companies have not responded directly to shareholder resolutions in the past. They will, oppose it in their proxy statement, but they won't engage us. There's a couple of exceptions. We've had a couple of dialogues with Facebook, and Facebook went through a whole civil rights audit process, which is now, actually there's a shareholder resolution at Amazon to get a racial equity audit, which may be a similar process. And that process was meaningful because civil rights experts were participating in it. However, at the same time, Facebook also entertained the myth that there was conservative bias on their platform. And so at the same time that they put out this civil rights audit, they also conducted an audit of, quote, conservative bias. And there's lots of research demonstrating that there's actually no conservative bias. If anything, there's bias in favor of conservative content and right-wing and white supremacist content. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'm happy to give more specifics, but overall, I would say they don't touch it. They don't touch anything until, it's on the front page, and then they kind of feign ignorance, deny it, or come out with a new policy that looks good in writing, but then the enforcement is terrible.
And since you mentioned it, Hannah, a number of our members have co-filed some of the resolutions around racial equity audits, but could you give a little more specification on what that actually is, or what we're asking of companies when we ask them to do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can share a link to Facebook's civil rights audit, which Airbnb and Starbucks, I think, have also done them. But generally, it's a way of looking at the impact of the company's policies and practices by looking at what is the impact on civil rights. And so for a lot of the Facebook civil rights audit, it was really just lifting up the feedback that Facebook had been getting for a decade from civil rights groups and affirming it with, a Facebook product. Because it wasn't like the information was new. It just hadn't been wrapped into a report that was financed by the company itself. And so that legitimized that feedback. But again, civil rights groups and others have been lifting up and raising red flags about concerns of these companies for a really long time. And it's only recently that companies are committing to actually institutionalizing a process of considering the impact on civil rights. But part of the goal of a civil rights audit is to institutionalize that process. So it's not a one-time audit, but so that there's infrastructure within the company, including at the board and senior leadership levels, so that so that every department from product development to marketing, et cetera, is considering civil rights in their work. And it isn't an add-on after the fact, and it isn't a reaction to civil rights violations after they've happened. It's built into the process from the beginning. So Facebook has a long way to go on that. They did the audit, which is great, but the audit pointed out so many holes, which Facebook still has refused to address.
Thanks. Another question from some of the participants.
This is Dan Trado in Milwaukee. Corey and Hannah, thanks for sharing your experience today. My question is kind of simple. We have been engaged with companies through the School Sisters of St. Francis as shareholders, but do you bump your head or nose on how many times you go at the same company regarding a resolution that you may have changed slightly to keep on bringing it back? And if you get to the point of it just doesn't make sense to keep on going after them when you have no response, how do you handle that? Either one of you.
I mean, there's limited resources and no shortage of problems to address in the corporate community. So there's definitely a decision about how to be strategic. That said, I think the persistent small voices are often, unfortunately, sometimes it has to manifest as like a real material risk or a headline risk before it gets everyone else on board. but that consistent presence is really meaningful. In terms of how to approach it, I think there's a few things. One is like an escalation strategy, right? Where you start with something that's very collaborative and you start with a company and you just keep trying to search for the right person in the company. Like, don't get stuck at IR, try to find the competent person internally and go say, okay, well, if I can't talk to you, I want to talk to the CEO, I want to talk to a board member, try to escalate it in that way. And then if that's insufficient, then build your group of investors that are interested. And so add momentum that way. You can go from a private engagement to a public, where you say this is a public letter and you publish it on your website and try to generate some press or blog, or even just put a newswire. You know, I think you just pay $50 and you could do a press release that goes on the business wire. It's, you know, gets picked up by something. And then the shareholder proposal, I usually try to reserve as a last line of defense, because it is the most adversarial. I think there's a way to craft shareholder proposals that are more like there's a lot of the human rights stuff that just gets totally lost. And it's really frustrating. And especially with the new resubmission thresholds is going to be a huge challenge. But I also think there's growing momentum in terms of expectations for large managers to vote their proxies. And so I don't know how many of you are involved with the PRI, but I do some work with them on active ownership and expectations around, like, if you're a PRI signatory, you should be voting your proxies and you should be thinking about it in this way. And it's really pushing people to support the issues that they say they care about, that they say, oh, human rights are material. It's like, well, then you should be voting on human rights proposals. So I also think there's some momentum behind investor participation in proposals, and that helps. But crafting the proposal the right way is it's a weird art, to do it in a way that, and so I think that was one reason that the workforce equity proposal was really great, because it was like, saying the board should have oversight of this issue in the middle of COVID, it was like such an easy win. And now there's like this source of accountability that we can push on and follow up on. And if they fail at it, then it's like there's reasons for a lot of investors to challenge them. I think directors, and this is what I'm saying, it's like a personal thing. I think voting against directors loudly is something that, people get their feelings hurt and they're sensitive to it. And so that's another escalation strategy that I think is not always well used, but I do think that can have a difference. Say, like, look, you're in charge of the sustainability committee. You're supposed to be competent on these things. You guys have you guys have demonstrated no competence. And so this is a vote of no confidence. And then you just share that widely. There's like rules about how to share information about proxy voting, but share that widely. I think that's another way to advance it. But it's very tricky to get the shareholder proposal to kind of thread the needle of like what large institutional investors are going to dig into and support, and have it still be like true to the purpose. I do think there's a way to do it, though.
Hanna, do you have a remark on that as well?
No, I think Corey captured it.
Okay. Sister Maureen, it looked like you might have a question.
Yes. So there's civil rights audit. Is that something you would suggest for an Anglo congregation of nuns to do on ourselves? With, and how do we go about changing our internal structures without feeling like we're hiring a token person of color? Of course, we would pass our 40% range with women, but not with people of color. What would you suggest for us? Would this be a good tool to start us?
Well, I love this question, first of all, because I think it points to sometimes we have a hypocrisy in asking companies to do things that we ourselves are not yet doing. And that includes things like civil rights audits. So I love that you're thinking about, what is the representation of people of color in our organization? How white are we? How did we get this way? What is the impact of that? How does it impact our ability to do racial justice work? Those are amazing questions. I absolutely think, whether you call it an audit or just begin the process of looking at how racism is showing up in your community, whether it's mostly white or whether it's racially diverse. That's a great place to start. I'm happy to connect with you more offline if you want some more resources about it, but there is a lot of work happening in this space, including in investing. And I'm reminded there was a webinar even on Tuesday that I think Harvard Business School Alumni Association put together that Ivy Jack was on. I mentioned her earlier. That was about how does white supremacy culture show up in our organizations and what do we do about it? So that's a great place to start too. I can share a link in the chat to a document that kind of explains what I mean when I say white supremacy culture. But yes, I would say absolutely starting with ourselves and the work that we have to do internally is a great place to start.
I also just appreciate that question. That's like, I wish we got that reaction from companies more and from peers more, but we did just do an internal training with a group called Aorta. Hannah, do you know them? I mean, that's just like one training group, but they're just so thoughtful. And it was just like a 2-hour training, but they do more involved things, including long-term work plans and helping to kind of develop, oh yeah, great. Yeah, Hannah's, and I have to say that the work Hannah's doing on this and the RJI, it's just really, really thoughtful. And I think there's a response of like a knee-jerk response that we see a lot of like, so just tell me what to do. I want to fix it. Tell me what to do. And it's like a much deeper and more introspective process and much harder process than just that. So, and I think their work reflects that in an incredible way. So just lots of props to Hanna and RJI.
Sister Maureen, to that question about the reflection on self, Father Mike Crosby, our founder, at one of the shareholder meetings, raised that issue with a board that was all male, to which the CEO had replied to him, Father, we'll take your advice on that when you all change the composition of the priesthood. Tim, you've got a question.
Yeah, a quick follow-up. Tim Duane with the School Sisters of Notre Dame here, and I'm at my office is Elm Grove. First follow-up with Sister Maureen. Yeah, SSND, we've just in the last couple of years started to take a serious look on the issue of racial justice and equity things. We have 3 paths of sustained engagement we've identified, and we've just contracted with Team Dynamics to do a multi-year, assessment of our organization and work through a lot of things. I don't know if our investments were part of that. So I wanted, following up from Hannah, I want to make sure that that area in racial justice equity in our investment outlook is reflected as well. We've moved a long way towards impact investing, but I'm not sure how much that's reflected. So I really appreciate that. My question is really base level for Hanna and Corey. For the individual who says, boy, I wonder, if my investments, if I have an investment manager or through my company is reflecting these values, the ones Corey mentioned with Domini in terms of universal HR and ecological sustainability, and Hanna with racial justice. What's the simple starting point for an individual to say, how do I reach out to my investment advisor or my HR folks to raise these questions?
It is, in many cases, a horribly convoluted process. If you have like an investment account with a financial advisor, that's easy because then you just say, look, I want to see products that reflect this, and they can help you pick, whether it's picking companies based on specific things you have or picking products or other managers that can serve those ends. But most people have their money in a 401k. And so in that case, generally your employer, the plan sponsor will have there's like plan fiduciaries, and they pick the menu of plans you have access to. So there's always a default option, and almost everyone ends up in that. And it's pretty much never an ESG fund. And then there might be other options. And so you can go to those fiduciaries. They are a fiduciary to you. They owe you that duty. They're supposed to act in your best interest. And you say, look, my best interest requires something that recognizes racial justice. And we need at least to have an option on here that includes that. And so they can add it to the menu. The best thing, especially since, as faith-based institutions, I think there's a really good case to be made for the alignment that like the default option should be a responsible investment product. Sometimes the fees are higher. That's usually where the fiduciaries get caught up. But, it's like an internal organizing campaign. Get some colleagues, go to find who this fiduciary is, and press them to have better options included. If you have a pension, it's a slightly different structure, but you have trustees. And so you can go to those trustees with the same concerns and say, do you vet our asset managers based on these criteria? And getting trustees, again, convoluted but powerful, getting the trustees to ask managers, like when they're going to say, okay, we need someone to manage our fund for the next 5 years, when they interview them to say, what do you do about climate change? What do you do about racial justice? Even if you don't hire them, that manager walks away like, shoot, we did not have a good enough answer to this. And it's so powerful. So I think those are the main ways that you would interact. Pension, 401k, or a personal investment account. But it's tough. And you can also go directly to the manager, but that's the, long shot. But you can do like a change.org type petition to Vanguard and say, I'm an investor. And Hannah, I feel like you've done some of this work, maybe. But like, I'm an investor, I hold a 401k with you, and we need to see better action from you. And that's a very kind of like attenuated connection, but it's something. And I think some of that organizing exists, so you can sign on to those and join that kind of work.
Yeah, and I would just add, I put a link there in the chat to a group called Adesina, which is a queer women of color owned investment firm. They have a great visual that just shows that there's a spectrum for investments. And, at the most extractive end is just the regular stock market, where you have not asked any questions and it's just, you're getting what you get. And then there's things like ESG and other screens that you can use to say, okay, I want to make sure I'm not participating in the most racist or the most, sexist companies or impacts. But there's a whole other part of that spectrum, which includes getting out of the stock market entirely and investing in direct investments in what folks call the regenerative economy, or the restorative economy. And that's really about actually not participating in the stock market and not expecting, what we call market returns, but actually connecting to a return on social justice impact as a way of living in a new kind of economy that we want to build that works better for everyone. Because at the end of the day, the stock market is still building profit for mostly the 1% at the expense of poor people and people of color. And so, I just want to offer that there are options that even are outside of the stock market. So that would probably not be, your pension fund or your 401k, but that's a conversation that lots of people are having. And there's a lot of cool vehicles and organizations that are creating opportunities to invest in, land and reparations for Black people and returning land to Native communities and things like that, including super local initiatives, close to where you live. So happy again to talk more about that offline, but there's like a whole world about that.
I think if you have a pension, your trustees, your fiduciaries are going to have a heart attack if you say you'll accept below market returns. But for a pension fund, you could say we want to have a small allocation from the fund to experiment in this space. So you wouldn't say put our whole retirement assets in here, but you could dedicate like a sleeve to like high impact. And then with the idea that hopefully it demonstrates something valuable to the whole community and that you can agree to grow that over time.
Thank you both. And I want to point out, Hannah also put in the chat box, I see a link to an article, White Supremacy Culture, that our Racial Justice Committee was discussing just Wednesday evening and have decided we're going to make it a major focus going forward and are going to take it up again next month. So synergy here. We're moving in the right direction. Don't be surprised, Hannah, if I follow up with a call. Thank you.
Look forward to it.
Thanks, everybody. This has been great. I'm really appreciative as well of the questions from our members and the insights and wisdom and experience shared by Hannah and Corey. I also am really appreciative of the fact that everybody stayed, having gone over time. We will capture what's in the chat and make sure we share that with you all as well. And you'll be getting, you'll see on our website the video available of this, the slides, and we'll also be sending around an evaluation, because your feedback on what you want to hear, what is most helpful for you, is really important as we program and arrange these toward the future. Also, those who will be hearing this on via the recording, we're appreciative you've taken the time and joining us through this. And so thank you, everybody. That's the final word, and looking forward to being with you again soon.
Thank